Yay. Hello, everyone. Everybody's joining now. Thanks so much for joining us. We love doing our Disability Live webinars, and today we're going to be talking about inclusive educational technology. So I'll wait just a couple of minutes to see how many people join, but it looks like you're all hurrying in now, which is great to see. Here we go. Brilliant. It looks like majority of you have joined us already in the first minute, so that's brilliant. We can be happy about that. So today our Disability Live is on Learning Better, the path to inclusive educational technology. We have Lord Bethel, who's going to give a couple of his reflections. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to join us today, so he's actually been driving and pulled over to give a contribution for us. So you'll see that letter shortly. We've got 5 panelists here today who are going to talk to you about innovation in educational technology and other areas of education. So let's get started. Just a few housekeeping things to start off with. There is closed captioning, and there's also British Sign Language. We've got 2 interpreters today, and they'll switch. The chat box function is turned off presently for accessibility purposes, but there is a Q&A box. So if you have questions at any point during the presentation, please do enter your questions, and our panelists will be able to answer, hopefully quickly, but if not, we run out of time. That's also okay. We'll not leave your question unanswered. We'll make sure to upload the answers to any questions you ask on the website after the event. Recording and transcripts are always made available after events as well. So before we kick off, I just wanted to give a little bit of information about GDI Hub, the Global Disability Innovation Hub. We are a research and practice centre driving disability innovation for a fairer world. And that means that we're a community interest company, and we're also an academic research centre based out of UCL. We're also the official WHO collaboration centre for assistive technology, and we work across 5 themes. So this year it's things like cultural participation, EdTech is one, climate resilience and others. And we work across 5 domains, and that is research, innovation, teaching, implementation of programs, and wider advocacy. To date, we worked in 35 countries, and we've reached 22 million people in our 5 short years. That's a lot, and we plan to continue. And we recently published our our strategy, our new strategy for 2021 to 24. And as part of that strategy, EdTech was a very particular area of focus. So for us, this is a really exciting moment to bring people together to talk about this theme, and also to look to the future and see what EdTech might do next. So our speakers today, thank you to all of them for joining us. Kathy Holloway from GDI Hub, so our academic director, Rick Bell speaking on behalf of BATA, Robert McLaren from Policy Connect, Charlotte's here from the World Bank, Lord Bethel, also, and Asma from UNICEF. So we're really very much looking forward to hearing from all of you. So without further ado, I'd like to pass to our first speaker. Oh, that's not our first speaker. Hang on a second. Oh no, my slides. So, Kate, could you read the line of our first speaker, please? I'm sorry, I can't access.
Hi there, Catherine. Sorry.
Hi, could you just read the name of our first speaker, please?
Yeah, sure, no problem.
Apologies, everyone. Unfortunately, I can't access my document.
So first up, we have Rick Bell coming to speak to us from BATA.
Thanks, Rick, over to you.
Thanks, guys. Good afternoon, folks. Happy Friday. I'm going to talk primarily about the UK, and I'd like to start with some statistics from the Department for Education. So currently, 5.1% of pupils in all UK sectors, school sectors in the UK, have been identified to have dyslexia. 150,000 pupils receive specific support for dyslexia. That's only 2%. Further to this, and according to the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Dyslexia, it's estimated that 17% of pupils in schools in the UK actually have dyslexia. So with the current model, we're currently providing supports to 2% of pupils for dyslexia when we believe 17% of the population have dyslexia. Further to this, there are currently 1.4 million pupils in UK schools with an education, health and care plan, which is roughly 15% of the school population. Currently in the UK, about 3% of the school population have access to inclusive or assistive technology. So some 15% of the population who would benefit from the use of assistive technology, only 3% actually have access to any. This is classic iceberg syndrome, where 10% of the iceberg that is visible above the water is the piece that gets dealt with. And this is the profoundly disabled pupils, the pupils with serious cognitive impairments, visual impairment, etc. And these complex needs are supported excellently through our amazing network of special schools. But what about the 90%, the mass of the iceberg that's hidden beneath the surface? The unidentified pupils in mainstream education struggle with literacy, that struggle with access to the curriculum, and most importantly, and this is the most important piece, that are afraid to be supported by a traditional medical model, as it highlights them as being different from their mates, and in their minds, it makes them look stupid. The medical model of disability support in general education, it doesn't work. Being the only kid in the classroom who is given the big chunky laptop to sit with, or being the kid who has the strange lady come in to read their exams papers for them, it's the opposite of inclusive. So, can inclusive educational technology fix this problem? Well, the answer is by itself, no, of course it can't. But by the incorporation of inclusive educational technology into our teaching and learning practices and the build out of a universal design strategy, can that massively improve outcomes for learners that are currently struggling? Those learners who may leave school without a solid grasp of reading and writing, or the pupil who has the potential to be an A-star pupil, but has always struggled to access content at the same level as the peers, but have continued to struggle on and ended up with a B. Can the proper use of educational technology improve outcomes for those learners? And the answer to that is yes. But what are the challenges in implementing universal design, specifically in the UK? Unfortunately, most schools don't know what they don't know. And this is the heart of the challenge that we have in the UK and specifically in England. Since the dissolution of BECTA in 2010 and the policy implemented by the government to devolve school decision-making to individual schools, there's been a downward spiral in knowledge in schools. The local head teacher being held to account by local parents for outcomes in a local school at its simplest level seems to make sense, but it doesn't take into account that most schools are small to medium in size and that budgets are stretched, and as such simply cannot afford a full-time educational technologist to keep up to date with what is best practice in EdTech. If we look to where there is best practice in the United States, or even within the United Kingdom, north of the border in Scotland, or the Education Authority here in Northern Ireland, there are school districts or education authorities or local councils who do have the means to employ teams of people to stay on top of what is best practice, to bulk procure to drive down prices, and to work with curriculum leads to integrate technology into an inclusive educational strategy for learning. But when you're a rural English secondary school with 400 pupils and your IT lead is also the geography teacher and also the part-time lollipop man, you simply don't know what you don't know, unless of course you have the good fortune of having a real tech champion within the school who's convinced the senior management team to go all in with EdTech. And this does happen, but it leads to ultimately a postcode lottery in support. What does good look like? In my opinion, it looks like schools with a culture where there's no need for a Senko, There's no need for a Senko because every teacher is a SEND teacher. Where there is equal access to digital devices and learning materials are universally accessible. And yes, unfortunately, that does mean that the RE teacher who's been handing out the same hard copies for 20 years will have to take the time and effort to learn how to digitize that material, but more importantly, digitize their teaching style. It means consistency and access to tools in school, at home, and on exams. It means deploying tools on a universal basis and to remove stigma, but also recognizing the principle that tools can be essential for some and beneficial for all. It means making tools available all the time, but giving flexibility to when they are used and devolving that to the student. But most importantly, it means a shift in teaching and learning practices. So how do we get there? Firstly, we need to stop this depressing return to normal post-pandemic. Last year, there were some 1 million devices deployed during lockdowns and a rapid digitization of education. But unfortunately, we're already hearing, oh, we don't need this anymore. The work being done through the EdTech strategy, by the government through the EdTech strategy and the build out of the demonstrator programs and the like, the tech innovation hubs, it's a good start, but we have to go further than that. There needs to be a cultural shift that is uniform across all schools and not by chance in a few. And this needs to be driven from the top. As such, I argue that regionalised or national bodies could define best practice in inclusive EdTech, but not individual schools. The model has to change, and we will not see significant change in outcomes, and certainly no uniformity without that change. Thanks.
Thanks so much. That was an amazingly passionate speech and really well-rounded as well. And really appreciated your perspective. I think when you mentioned about sort of not going back to normal, I think a lot of disabled people would welcome that, not just in education. So you definitely win me over with that one. But on to our next speaker. It's Charlotte from the World Bank. We're really pleased to have you, Charlotte.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And good morning, good day, and good evening to everybody. Thank you very much to the GDI Hub for hosting this important discussion and for inviting me to participate in it. ICT tools are playing an increasingly vital role in advancing educational access and learning outcomes for children with disabilities. The role of EdTech and how it impacts children with disabilities was really thrust into the global development spotlight since March 2020, when COVID-19 pandemic presented itself and required governments to pivot to remote distance learning with a high emphasis on EdTech interventions. The last 2 years have served very much as a stress test of sorts for the role of ICT for disability inclusive education. And we've seen the successes, but similarly, we've seen very much the widening gaps between children with disabilities and children without disabilities. Unfortunately, despite the tremendous potential, a gap exists between technology advancements and their large-scale application in educating children with disabilities, particularly in low and middle income countries. So in partnership with the GDI Hub, the World Bank's Inclusive Education Initiative, which we refer to as the IEI, undertook a landscape review of ICT and EdTech for disability inclusive education, including how they supported continued learning during the pandemic. The report itself will be publicly launched in early 2022. So please look out for the report. Insights from multiple stakeholders, including teachers, parents, and caregivers, very importantly, government officials and civil society stakeholders, served to cement what many of us already knew. And what that was that the successful use of technology to enhance educational participation and learning outcomes requires a comprehensive ecosystem approach, and that piecemeal approaches do not work. The insights and findings that emerged from this study reflected the themes under the EdTech Hub of 6 Ps of the education systems framework. And these Ps are people, products, pedagogy, policy, place, and provision. So allow me to consider these Ps individually. The first key area is people. Currently, teachers, parents, and other educational support figures lack sufficient expertise in inclusive education and ICT, as well as sufficient resources to successfully support children with disabilities to access and take advantage of EdTech. The next obstacle, or the next P, is the P for products. Most EdTech devices and software are way too expensive for families and schools to access easily. Many products also fail to be truly inclusive of children with more complex needs. The third P, and a very important area, is the P on pedagogy. There is a lack of understanding about effective and useful pedagogical approaches and practices to assess the educational needs of children with disabilities. There's a dearth of mechanisms in place for monitoring their impact on learning experiences. The changes required would not be possible without another P, and that's the P around policies. Existing policies for inclusive education and ICT are often separate and poorly integrated, which makes it difficult to coordinate actions across government bodies with fragmented responsibilities and between actors working in different areas. And then the fifth P is a very crucial P, and it's place. Inclusive and mainstream schools, we know, struggle to access the necessary equipment that students with disabilities need. And as seen during COVID-19, children and families do not always have the technology and skills they need at home. Another survey on COVID-19 conducted by the IEI, the Inclusive Education Initiative, showed that many families struggled with inequitable access to devices, struggled with internet availability, data packages, and accessible learning materials. And all of this happening in the midst of a global pandemic. Now, I'd like to finalize my remarks by addressing the last P, which is the P on provision. Funding mechanisms and procurement processes can make or break the sustainability and the long-term impact of many initiatives. We need to use these lessons to improve our investments and programming going forward. And so let me provide you with a sneak preview of our report's recommendations. And this is, of course, not an exhaustive list, but just to give you a sense of what we will be recommending. To start with, developing technology and service infrastructure for inclusive education to enable massive scale distribution of evidence-based and small-scale innovations. This means designing and testing funding mechanisms to support innovation and matchmaking between policymakers, purchasers, and producers of technology, drawing on the 6 Ps that I just mentioned. Next, we must work to strengthen systems and shape markets to systematically improve the provision of inclusive education, and very, very importantly, reduce the cost of assistive ICT for inclusive education products. This includes supporting teachers, in addition to supporting teachers, building their capacity. It means investing in the development of local tools to assess current country capacity, to review country systems of procurement, and the need for ICT for inclusive education products. None of these efforts will be effective without stakeholder buy-in. And hence we must work with parents, caregivers, children, organizations of persons with disabilities to ensure that they are involved in identifying the need for and the development of EdTech to ensure that every learner's needs are being met. Finally, we must capture better data and evidence that is vital to policy making, identification of learners, early intervention, and mapping of progress. And I'll leave it here and look forward for further reflections and discussion from colleagues. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. That was really brilliant and lovely to hear some of the recommendations that are going to come from our report. And in particular, I noted the identifying the need for technology, which is quite an interesting space, isn't it? So to move on, I'd love Robert to speak from Policy Connect.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Catherine. I'm Robert McLaren, and I head up the Assistive and Accessible Technology team at Policy Connect, which is a cross-party think tank. And one of our activities is supporting the all-party parliamentary group for assistive technology. Like Rick, my thoughts will be UK focused, but hopefully we'll have some application to other parts of the world as well. I suppose I just wanted to start as well briefly, as I was thinking about today's session, kind of reflecting on my own educational experience and where technology fitted into that. I'm severely dyslexic, and when I think about what a school day was like for me when I was sort of 10 or 11 and there was no technology, not only was it a struggle then, but I really think if I was to go back and try and do the same day now, I don't think I'd do much better than I did. I think I'd still be handing in unfinished worksheets. So it really is something that can, lack of this technology can be kind of an absolute hard stop on someone's ability to participate in technology, as I'm sure everyone taking part in this session will be aware. And then for me, and I think this is a common experience, people gain access to technology later on in their educational career, and it makes a huge difference. I know we're going to talk as a panel and with everyone about the barriers to adopting assistive and accessible technology in education, and previous speakers have already talked in this way. That's where I want to pick up as well. What we've heard from previous speakers is how central awareness and training is to implementing this technology. I think it's so central that in some ways it can be helpful to split the whole question of barriers into two camps, awareness and training on the one hand, and then what we might call resources and permissions on the other. And I think we can apply that kind of framework, which I think is very much compatible with the PEAS framework that we heard about before, to the individual learner, to a teacher, to a learning provider. And so, we can think about for the individual learner, you just need that awareness to get going. As Rick said, if you don't know what you don't know, and you need more than just somebody saying there is such a thing as assistive and accessible technology. It needs to become real for you. So you've maybe seen somebody use it, or you've heard about one or two products, and you can kind of, you also then crucially have the awareness of where would I need to go to try to find out more? Where would I need to go to get more support? And you can imagine the same sort of question for an individual teacher. having that base level of awareness, and then of what it is and what it can do, and then awareness about where to go to get resources. And similarly for a education provider, kind of an awareness as a capacity of an organization, and where of what it can do, but also where it needs to look for outside help as well. And then onto resources and permissions. I think we can think about that clearly as, you know, the technology itself, the products as part of resources, but also external support. So from the point of view of the learner, a teacher who understands this and can train you is a resource externally. From the point of view of the education provider, it might be, you know, the kind of regional body that Rick was suggesting be established as an external resource. And then, as to reiterate again, you know, the hardware and software is a resource too. And finally, I think permissions, which sometimes gets overlooked a little bit. It's really important that people have permission to use technology in assessments and exams, that they have permission to use the technology in the classroom, and they're not being told that they're sort of playing with their phone or something like that. And I suppose the kind of cultural point that's been mentioned before about people feeling comfortable to use technology is that that's a sort of a cultural permission, and it's worth thinking about as well. When it comes to, I'll say briefly about sort of some of the proposed ways to break down these barriers, which we'll get into more. You know, clearly one approach is just, you know, try and address all of those problems all at once. But I think it is interesting to hear about different approaches which emphasize one or other barrier. So, for example, the Department for Education in the UK at the moment is preparing to launch a pilot on awareness raising and training in mainstream secondary schools. And that pilot, as I understand it at least, doesn't include supplying any additional technology or additional resources in the form of specialists who would come and assess pupils or something like that. It is a kind of awareness raising and training first approach. And therefore, I think it makes for an interesting experiment, in part because it asks, how far can you go without actually providing much in the way of additional resources? To what extent can you just sort of raise awareness, increase training, and then the school will figure it out? And I can understand skepticism about that, but it's at least worth working out, as I say, kind of how far the kind of awareness and training only gets you. And then, of course, you can identify what additional things are needed after that. Another approach is to really emphasize the what might be called the digital capability of the education provider. And that's that kind of universal design for learning approach that's been talked about, where you think about the school's capabilities in terms of Wi-Fi access, just the common use of technology within the school, making that accessible. And, you know, if you have that kind of technology in place, then it's almost a kind of a reverse of the awareness first approach. Because the thought is, if you put the technology, if it's already there to hand, then it's not that much of a step to tell people about, you know, how it works or what features it has, and that you can raise, you know, on that theory, if you like, you can raise awareness more effectively if you're telling people about a solution that's already there, rather than raising awareness in a way that maybe leaves people thinking, well, this technology is great, but I don't know how I would get hold of it for my pupils. And so the sort of resources first kind of universal design, build up the digital capacity of education providers is yet another kind of angle on the problem or place to begin. And then I think just a real final reflection for me on the resourcing point. One of the tensions I think that we hear about is we want to some extent centralize budgets so that as Rick talked about as well, individual schools aren't forced to pay for things that are too expensive for their small budget. And then on the other hand, we hear that we don't want to rely too much on central government funding, which might be here today and gone tomorrow. And so I think that's an interesting one for our discussion later. And I suppose one way to think about it is that to the extent that we do want a system where schools in some sense self-resource or pay for some of the technology through their own budgets, at very least I think we would want it so that they're not taking a risk in doing that, so that they're only sustaining these programs through their own budgets once it's been demonstrated to them that funding is going to be valuable, and we're not asking schools to shell out a load of money in the hope that these interventions will be effective for them. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Robert. Another really interesting presentation, actually mentioning your personal experience. I'm dyslexic too, and so it was interesting hearing your version of your experience. And I, as a child, definitely remember being very good at copying my peers, so that without being noticed, I should say, rather than hand in a paper that had incorrect answers on. So no, I do very much appreciate that. And also you mentioned that you're coming from a UK perspective. It did actually strike me how during COVID we noticed how many households either had no internet or very slow internet, which prevented from people from actually accessing education too. So I wonder how many of these issues you've identified are actually, applicable in both high income and low income countries as well. But on to our next speaker, because I'm not one, just the chair. Asma, are you there?
Yes, hi, thank you.
Brilliant.
Hello, everyone, and thanks to GDI Hub for the invitation to join this webinar today. It's my pleasure to be here with you and to talk about this very important issue. To begin with, I'd like to share a couple of statistics from the recently published UNICEF report, Seen, Counted, Included, using data to shed light on the well-being of children with disabilities. The report looks at findings from the analysis of global data on children with disabilities across more than 60 indicators and presents a new global estimate of 240 million children with disabilities around the world. What we see from the data, as expected, is that globally, children with disabilities are more likely to be out of school than children without disabilities across all education levels. Out of school rates increase during secondary school and are higher among children with multiple disabilities and highest amongst children with severe disabilities. Children with disabilities are 49% more likely than children without disabilities to have never attended school and are 42% less likely to have foundational reading and numeracy skills. What this indicates is that not only are children with disabilities not participating in school at the same rate as children without disabilities, but that even those in school are experiencing disparities in learning outcomes. To address these disparities, we need the systematic removal of barriers across education systems to make them inclusive for all learners, so that learners with disabilities are participating in education on an equal basis with others, in full recognition of their rights per the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, amongst other international human rights conventions. We also need a paradigm shift from education systems that accommodate individual differences to education systems that are inclusive of individual differences at the outset. One of the key enablers to addressing these disparities, supporting the removal of barriers, and facilitating participation in education is educational technology, including assistive technologies. In line with a twin track approach of mainstreamed as well as targeted solutions, it's important to consider EdTech solutions that are inclusive of all learners, alongside more targeted assistive technology solutions that support individual learners to fully participate in learning. However, we know inclusive and accessible educational technologies are not as widely available or in use as they should be. And there are several barriers to this, including the cost, both of production as well as the cost to families, the lack of appropriate infrastructure in many settings, teacher knowledge around inclusive education, including universal design for learning and the use of technology in the classroom, and the lack of inclusive and accessible learning content and materials that are developed on the basis of universal design for learning. Additionally, while the availability of data is improving, there's still a need for more information and evidence around the use and impact of EdTech and assistive tech for learners with disabilities. There are several initiatives in place to respond to some of these barriers, including partnerships like At Scale that aims to increase the provision of cost-effective assistive technology, GIGA that works to strengthen infrastructures to expand school connectivity, UNICEF's Reimagine Education initiative that harnesses the power of technology to provide learning opportunities to every child and adolescent through initiatives such as the Learning Passport, and our recently launched Accessible Digital Learning Portal that serves as a one-stop shop for accessible and inclusive learning solutions and resources for education stakeholders. At UNICEF, we're also working with content developers to strengthen their capacity to develop accessible and inclusive learning content and materials, to address the production ecosystem and incorporate principles of universal design for learning so that materials are gender sensitive and disability inclusive and can be used by all learners, including those with disabilities, across different platforms, softwares, and hardware. And we're ensuring that we do this in partnership with the end users, persons with disabilities. We're also working on strengthening teacher capacity and knowledge, particularly around inclusive education and universal design for learning. But we also know that we need to strengthen teacher capacity around adopting technology in their pedagogy and teaching. And we need to do better in terms of understanding local needs and understanding the availability and usability of different solutions across different contexts. And again, partnering with organizations of persons with disabilities is fundamental to do this well. Last but not least, the value of collecting data around the availability and use of low-tech and high-tech educational technology cannot be overstated. Without evidence on the availability, use, and effectiveness of interventions and solutions, we simply cannot ensure that we understand what works best. To really move the needle on this, I think it's really important for us to advance ongoing partnerships and work to further prioritize some of these enablers to comprehensively strengthen inclusive education systems and enabling environments. This means policy, inclusive financing and budgeting, evidence, data and monitoring, strengthening the capacity of teachers, enhancing the production and provision of EdTech and assistive tech, as well as around the development of universally designed learning materials and content. These can only be prioritized through collective advocacy and political will that is backed by financial commitments and the full realization of the rights that children with disabilities have to learn in the same schools and classrooms as their peers without disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asma. That was really, really interesting and great to hear some of the work from your recent report as well. I would love to quickly show a video from Lord Bethel of Romford, who has, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, was planning on being here today, but unfortunately couldn't. He had to travel, but he has provided us with a video. So we're going to try and play that for you now. And thank you, Kate.
I want to say a big thank you to the Global Disability Innovation Hub for inviting me to the Disability Innovation Live webinar on inclusive educational technology. It's an absolutely tremendous event that you're hosting here. I'm really proud that you're doing it, and I'm passionate about the objectives of what you're trying to do. Because having been the Innovation Minister at the Department for Health and Social Care during the pandemic, I saw for myself how much incredibly valuable science, research and technology there is available for tackling some of the world's most knotty problems. When it comes to getting educational opportunities to all of society, those with disabilities and disadvantages of all kinds, it's just incredibly important that we take those innovations and use them as effectively as we possibly can. I would really encourage all those on this call to push hard to make sure that the tremendous insights, technologies and innovations that we have, whether that's software that helps people to access education remotely, whether that's improvements in the way that we can get educational materials in front of those with hearing and other disabilities. All of the technologies that we've got available really must be deployed as effectively as possible. So thank you very much indeed to all those who are taking part in this webinar, and I look forward very much indeed to the summit next year and the great amount of pressure and improvement that will help deliver. Thank you everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Well, as you can tell, Lord Bethel was very much indeed travelling, so apologies for the background noise there. But we're very thankful that he was able to participate in some way. So thank you very much, Lord Bethel. It was great to hear your thoughts. And when he references the summit, he's talking about the Global Disability Summit next year. So last but not least, I want to pass over to my colleague Kathy Holloway, who should be here, to just give us a few minutes of her reflections. Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks, and thank you to everybody. I think we're seeing in the chat and in the conversations that have happened that it doesn't matter if you're based in the UK or globally, we see similar problems. And those problems stem from fragmentation of policy and resources, but also what I call sweating or stressing our assets. The biggest assets that we have for people to learn are our teachers and the caring and the carers of children, as well as the children themselves. And when we place children with disabilities into classrooms where they are set up to fail, that stresses them and prevents them from achieving their potential. But also when we don't provide the support and the training and the resources to our teachers and to the family and carers that help support our children with disabilities, then we are unable to for the children to realise their potential, but also we end up with the added bonus of a very stressed workforce and caring force. And I think one thing that COVID has taught us is that stress is not a good thing. We all knew that beforehand, but we have all been, every single individual around the planet has been put into a condition of advanced stress, I think, over COVID. And our systems have been pressure stressed. And Charlotte mentioned that in her presentation. And the report that we looked at with the World Bank has clearly demonstrated, like Charlotte said, in some instances what we know, and some of that is coming through in the chat. For example, we need system strengthening and market shaping. We need to begin to drive down the unit cost of devices. But once we've driven down the unit cost of devices, we also need to make sure that teachers, parents and children are educated in how to use those devices. So that brings me on to sort of the second sphere of where we need to influence, and that's at the community, family and sort of out of school learning level. More and more people are learning out of school, especially within the COVID pandemic, and the individual learner, again, it doesn't matter if you're in the UK or if you're in Kenya, each classroom is no longer a sanctuary where you're all equalized to some level. So no matter your background, there was a chance you go to school and then you should be in the same learning environment. And now we're in a position where some people have electricity, some people do not have electricity. Some people have multiple generations living in a small confined flat, and other people have spare rooms that they can use as classrooms. And that means that those that are rich will do better in any geography, and that is unfair. And we know that there is a link between disability and poverty. And so therefore we know that children globally, regardless of their geography, will be worse off, generally speaking, during the pandemic. And yet we have this great opportunity. Charlotte has mentioned it, it was mentioned by others as well, of technology and what technology can do. And we at GDI Hub try to take an applied and a basic science approach to everything that we do. So we believe that when we go and we research things out in the world, that they give us new insights into how we can then bring back into academia new kind of recipe for a new invention. And we've had examples of that both from us and from others. So if you think, for example, the Orbit 20 reader, which has nothing to do with GDI Hub, but was brought together by a consortium where they needed to drive down the unit cost of Braille readers globally. And what they invented is now being distributed globally and is being used in classrooms around the world. And that took a disruptive partnership to come together. It took a new way of thinking, but it also needed the data and evidence. And that's my fourth cluster. So moving on from the innovation and the technology onto the data and evidence. We have fragmented policies, and we have ministers in various countries and officers working in various districts that are also stressed. And we have to explain to them the value of inclusive education. We have to do a better job of surfacing not just where children are and where children are being left behind, but also what is the impact of providing the benefit of an inclusive education. And as far as I'm concerned, that must go beyond a simple cost-benefit analysis on that individual or on the family unit or even on that societal unit. It has to be looked at by a much broader remit of the social benefit to us as a society. I'm absolutely convinced that when we are more equal as a society across anything, that we are better, we are stronger, we are more resilient, we are happier. And therefore, how we begin to really delve into the economics of measuring that is important. So I would urge us to come together to continue the great work, both in the UK, and you can see what's happening through Policy Connect and BATA. I mean, it's shocking that we have a 13% discrepancy that Rick mentioned on just getting the technology to people who have dyslexia to be able to learn. I know that even within academia, we struggle to get the equipment and the software to people when they start their degrees, and that is unacceptable. We have to do better. So I don't think it matters where we are in the world. I think we can share best practice on how we strengthen our systems, how we shape our markets, how we learn and build resilient systems with our communities, and how we develop new technologies and innovations that help support learning based solely on better data and evidence. And so on that, I'll hand back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Passion, it's great, isn't it? Ultimately, I guess education is part of the human experience, and we need to make sure that we include everyone. We are going to move on now to our structured Q&A. So let me just bring up our slides for that.
Have you got it, Catherine? Or do you want me to?
Would you mind sharing? Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Kate. So our first question to all of our panelists, and our panelists can now turn on all of their cameras so that we can see them. Great, hello everyone. So our first question is, what is the biggest barrier to inclusive educational technology? I wonder if Kathy would like to speak to that, bearing in mind her very passionate last sentence.
The biggest barrier, if I had to pick one, a lack of money and a lack of knowing where to spend it in a systematic way. I think we constantly see silos of great practice that don't maybe scale particularly well. And I think that's because we don't know where to invest our money well across the system. And I think, if I can just say, we really have to be realistic that disability inclusion is it's verging on a wicked problem. It's very difficult to get right, even though it shouldn't be. The way that governments and finance systems are set up around the world at the moment makes it difficult, and so we have to pursue the twin track approach to overcome those. But that would be my first desire would be some more money and some better strategies for investing at scale.
Rick, do you want to come in on that question?
Sure. It's interesting, actually. Rob mentioned during his opening that really barriers are split into two. First being awareness and training, and secondly being permissions and resourcing. And what Kathy was saying there around money is absolutely correct in terms of the permissions and resourcing piece. But I don't think that that is a problem in many countries. In many developed countries, I don't think that money is a problem because much of inclusive technology has become very cheap and very available, but the awareness issue is more of a problem. So in the UK and the US and Western Europe and Australia, a lot of these countries where we're starting to see the introduction of universal design to a greater or lesser extent. I think training and awareness is more of a problem than funding, but Kathy is absolutely correct. In developing nations, I spent quite a lot of time in India. For example, we went into schools in India and said, you should consider certain technologies, and they just looked at me and said, like, we don't have shoes on our kids' feet. So yeah, I absolutely see that resourcing piece as a challenge in certain parts of the world, but awareness and training is certainly more of a challenge in the developed world, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. I noticed Robert just nipped in before Kathy, so Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that point about to what extent is money a barrier, particularly in wealthier countries. And I suppose maybe one way to talk about it is that there may be money in the system in the UK and some other countries, but kind of where does it sit? So thinking, Rick, about your example of the small rural school, and does that on its own have the budget to purchase the technology it needs to, and would it get a good deal if it did, as opposed to buying more in bulk? And then also, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, there's that question of risk, which is even if you do physically, you do have the budget, you could break even by getting the technology. If that initial technology investment represents a really large part of your budget and you've never used it before, is it fair to expect the kind of individual education provider to take that risk, when, as we know, some providers in the past have sort of bought lots of kit and it hasn't worked out for them? They feel like I've been burnt in the past. And so
I was on mute.
so I sort of trailed off there, but just yeah.
No problem. Kathy, I know you had your hand up before.
Very quick points, I'm sure I should hear from our international colleagues too, but I think, just reflecting on it, if it was looking at a high income country, especially somewhere like the UK, I think it's actually, I still think it's funding related, but it's the stress of the teachers. And I've never gone into a school, spoken to a head teacher and they say, yes, we're fully resourced. I mean, I was volunteering in my local primary school over COVID because it was so stressed and had so few resources, and it had nobody to look after the children that had special needs in the classroom. So in my Friday afternoons, I was going in to help because the systems are creaking, genuinely creaking. And so I think that sometimes there's this misnomer in high income countries that this is all fine. We've got access to things. And it's not that I disagree with Rick. I agree with you that the money is there to unlock the technology, but somehow the central infrastructure for the education system seems to be creaking.
Charlotte, I wondered if you wanted to come in. I could see you nodding away there.
Yeah, no, I am nodding away because I agree with all the three comments made. And I do want to emphasize the point that, I think the digital divide is premised on a whole host of factors. And certainly all, the factors that my colleagues raised. But I also think that, there are aspects around inequality in societies that play out in relation to how people access technology. So, even in a place like Washington, D.C., where I am, during the pandemic, there were lots of kids, mainly Black and brown kids, that did not have access to the internet, families that don't have laptops. And so we can't underestimate marginalization and inequalities in societies in relation to how people access technology. So that's the first point. And then I think the point has been made by previous speakers around capacity of teachers to use the technology, the capacity of parents to engage with their children to use the technology. I also think there are functions around usability that are a barrier, maybe not the biggest barrier, but remain a barrier. And then, I think, as I mentioned in my remarks, what's really important about ensuring that educational technology is accessible is that it is part of a broader ecosystem. So, if you don't have internet access, it doesn't matter what kind of technology you have in place, it's not going to work. If you have internet access, you have the actual device, but you don't have data, which is something we heard when we ran the survey, you still can't access it. So there are lots of parts to it. And so I think we should think about resources, but not exclusively resources. And there's value in digging down to understand what are some of the other drivers that that prevent people from accessing educational technology.
Asma, did you want to come on into that point?
Sure, thanks. I'm like Charlotte, nodding away because just completely agree with everything that's been said already. And I just want to sort of pick up on one of the points that Charlotte made as well in her remarks about, we've tended to have an approach, I think, across working in inclusive education to take a piecemeal, let's try this project and let's pilot something and let's explore how this might work. And I think, just to reiterate the point that we really do need to look at it at a systemic level and look at all of these different variables that you just cannot simply address one and expect it alone to transform a system. And it really does come down to the funding, of course, the availability of the infrastructure, the data and evidence, the capacity. And we can try to tweak one or the other, but that's not going to result in actual lasting sustainable change until we actually have a more systematic approach to addressing these barriers across all of these different aspects. So just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm actually struck how I think, Asma, it was in your presentation, maybe Charlotte, it was in yours, about the actual cost of devices as being a core barrier. And then we've got two other questions, which I've already got, but I just want to ask this question to the panel just through curiosity myself. In sort of what role does the market play in getting access to educational technology, do you think, and what can we do about that? If anybody wants to jump in. Robert, you put your hand up.
Yeah, just a quick point on that. I think clearly it's helpful for users and education providers to be able to get a lower unit cost. When we think about how to achieve that, it's worth recognizing that that's not just a technical question about how the technology is designed or manufactured. It is a market question as well, because it has to do with scale. It has to do with the costs of marketing and reaching the consumer that technology developers have. So in some cases, the very same product could be a different price if we got some of these other policy questions right in terms of providing people with wider access to it.
I'm not sure who was first. Rick?
I'm not sure if I was, but I'll go. To the price point, an interesting way to look at this, I think, is certainly in the UK, we have one of the most advanced AT manufacturing industries, assistive technology manufacturing industries in the world. There's a huge amount of assistive technology comes out of the UK. And the majority of that is SMEs, small companies that are developing tools because they care about it. You get a lot of weak companies. There are, a few people who have an idea for how to help a friend or a relative, and they go away and they make it. And you'll find that the vast majority of these companies are not profiteering. They're not trying to make huge amounts of money. They're not big global corporations, and they want to be able to sell technologies to support as many users as they can, as cheaply as they can, because the cheaper they make it, the more widely available it is. And we are struggling in the advanced economies, the Western world, in being able to allow that those prices to come down, in helping organizations by thinking about things centrally. As I talked about at the beginning, when you've got a single school that has to be serviced by a company in terms of a sales guy and support staff, and it pushes costs up, and that pushes the costs of that has to be passed on, and that could be remedied if there was a decision taken to develop a set of experts who can look at these for sort of larger regional areas or national areas or whatever that would be, and costs would come down very, very considerably and very quickly.
Thank you. Asma, you've got your hand up again.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think there's also, a lot of value from the global perspective, considering the differences and understanding local needs, and looking at the capacities within different contexts to actually respond to those needs and strengthening those. And I think this is where the role of organizations of persons with disabilities is critical at the local level, because that's really how we can learn more, gather more evidence, have a better understanding of what the local needs are, but also what the infrastructural capacities are to respond to those. We've seen so many examples, I'm sure, of these wonderful technological advances and innovations that have come out of, I don't know, say, a high income country, and have been they've tried to distribute across an environment or a context that doesn't necessarily have the infrastructure to support that. And then it just sits in a cupboard somewhere in a classroom collecting dust. And so I just wanted to kind of highlight that importance of, really looking at it at a contextual level and ensuring that we partner with the appropriate local organizations, groups, civil society, et cetera, to get a real in-depth understanding of what works in different contexts. Thanks.
Thanks. Kathy?
Thank you. So I was just going to mention that I think that there's value in looking, I mentioned when I was talking about looking at the more social impact of an assistive technology, but what I was just thinking about a report that we're just finishing from the 80-20-30 program, which is in partnership with UCL's IIPP department, so the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And in there, we're beginning to look at what are the upstream and downstream multipliers of investing. So not thinking of it like assistive technology in almost like an austerity mindset, it's a thing that we've got to provide, a sort of deficit mindset, but beginning to think actually the need for these technologies is growing globally, and it's a growth mindset. And when you begin to look at it more of that sort of innovation mindset and going beyond sort of a traditional conventional cost benefit analysis, we see that the investment, you said just there, Vic, you were talking about the additional costs of things, right? So you've got like all the various costs, but those costs also provide jobs. so those costs also provide jobs, and that provides money back into a tax base, which can help support things. And we've done an analysis of India, Mexico, and I think South Africa, and we found that actually, if you look at the upstream and downstream components, the multipliers, it goes up. Investing in assistive technology had a benefit of over 300%, right? If you looked at the case of eyeglasses or hearing aids in India, for example, investing in those technologies would give you a 300% return on what you're investing in, if you look at the entire ecosystem of innovation. And I think that in order to win the argument, like how do we drive down the cost, and how do we like shape the market, we need to be making those arguments at a very high level, that this is a growth sector. This is a sector that can help your overall economy grow. It can produce manufacturing jobs, which people want in their countries. It can produce a new tax base. So I think we need to start having those conversations. But I'm also very cognizant of all of the questions that are coming in and the comments that are coming in from attendees, which are also looking at, okay, that's great. If I was one of them and I just heard what I said, I think, okay, that's great. But I'm like, this person is looking at 2,000 students in the school in India. How does that help me? And I think that when we talk about twin track, sometimes we're always talking about mainstreaming disability and then specific disability focused solutions. But I think there's also, with my GDI Hub hat on, there's a twin track in terms of going at this very high level and trying to influence, everything from UN organizations to government policy to, things like at scale, like let's keep influencing and pushing the agenda, but also let's shift the needle like at the community level right now, because people haven't got a generation to wait for that to trickle down. So I'm also very aware of the need to work with local and smaller, they might think of themselves as smaller, but actually they're possibly having more impact, units where we begin to also demonstrate the value of those initiatives and help people have the tools to advocate for themselves at a local level. Be quiet now.
No, it was great. It was great. Thank you so much for your contribution. And actually, I was thinking a little bit about your upcoming project, GDI Hub Accelerate, and its role in sort of changing the conversation around sort of innovation and scaling technology. So that's something for our participants to sort of watch out for in the coming year and over the next few months. But Charlotte, your hand's up too.
So just a small addition to a very rich conversation. I mean, I think there's also absolute value in diversifying production of technology, who's producing it, where it's being produced. And I think, you know, investing in local production is really important. Unfortunately, what we see is where we have local production, it's often quite expensive because it's not scaled. And I do think that that's an area, it's a policy question and something that needs to be explored a lot more. Because I think if we were able to do that, that could help drive down the costs and could perhaps address issues around better suited and usability of devices in the particular countries, right? So they'd be better suited for the region in which, or the country in which they're being developed. So just something to think about going forward.
Yeah, definitely. I'm just curious, sorry, just aware of the time. So I'm wondering if we could go to our next question, Kate, which, yeah, how should some of these barriers be overcome? And actually, could you show the third question as well? Because maybe these two are linked, considering what we've just spoken about, and that is how should some of these barriers be overcome, and what more can we do as part of the movement that cares about this issue? What can we do to make sure they are? So I offer that to the panelists to see what comes back. Charlotte, is that a new hand or is that an old hand? It's an old hand. Okay, Robert.
I can sort of just follow on from what Charlotte was saying though, because I think that the local production, sort of local solutions, is I think could be a paradigm shift in how we provide these technologies. We have quality control issues, we have scalability issues, we have, there are issues, but actually there's also huge opportunity in that space, and we're seeing a lot of great local solutions being developed. I feel like we're doing some work through 80-20-30 on how to maybe begin to scale some of these and also connect globally, because there's, you know, the digital infrastructure now should allow design to happen in one country, manufacture to happen in multiple countries, iterations to happen in multiple countries, to be fed into a central repository for people to be able to, you know, you download that device, you're able to make it yourself locally, maybe if you only said you're making 1 or 2 units, but if you're going to make 500 and sell them, you pay a license fee. There's various ways to, I think, scale that. And I think we've also sort of answered some of these questions in our great discussion. We went off track anyway. We do that a little bit, but and I see that Robert's got his hand up, so I'll hand over to Robert.
Robert, yeah, fire away.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Yeah, I thought maybe I'd just come back to this idea of digital capability of learning providers, education providers. So there, the idea is that you think about digital capability, you know, and then accessibility as a part of that, universal design and so on. So that would include sort of Wi-Fi and various pieces of technology, including, and that can include, you know, specialist technology as well. And I think that part of the thinking there is, you know, I'm a little bit, is we sometimes want to justify learning providers getting access to assistive technology as if it were a sort of a special intervention, and then we're going to kind of measure what outcomes, you know, better test scores or something has been achieved because we've sort of injected this technology into the school. And I wonder if that is the right way to think about it. I mean, where I work, we all have computers, and nobody did a study to say that we needed to have computers. It's just the norm of the world of work. And I don't know why we are applying this sort of other standard to schools and technology. And I think perhaps a shift along those lines, especially and importantly, if we make accessibility part of the definition of the digital capability of learning providers could provide a platform to make progress in this area.
I'm just wondering, actually, as you're talking, whether or not the impacts of a lack of educational technology is really known. Like, do our policymakers and decision makers really understand the consequences of this issue, sort of beyond that, you know, certain students might not get access to a certain amount of qualifications. You know, if I think about sort of an experience in dyslexia, which I can speak to, it wasn't necessarily that I didn't get qualifications, because I did, but it's the lack of confidence and the way that it impacts you as a person, and the whole kind of family unit as a whole, I think is yet to be quantified, because it does have different kinds of effects on the individual, not just, you know, whether or not someone might attain a degree or something like that. But Rick, you've got your hand up as well.
Actually, just to come in on that very point that you jogged my memory about something there, Cameron. The question as to whether or not the investment in assistive technology actually costs anything is a good one. And there was a study done, and I'll have to find this and circulate to the group later because I can't remember the exact details of it, that was commissioned to look at the cost of disabled student allowances in the UK. So for anybody who is not from the UK, the DSA is a government grant scheme that for students in higher education in the UK can access funding for assistive technology, which costs the government somewhere in the region of £200 million a year. And there was a study conducted, I think back in about 2012, looking at whether or not that was a true cost of the scheme. And what actually it uncovered was that DSA is actually cost neutral to the exchequer because of the increased educational outcomes of the people who access the scheme, and the increase in taxation and the like, the contribution they make to society throughout the rest of their lives. So investment in assistive technology is investment, it is not a cost.
That's really interesting, actually, and I'm going to reference our good friends at AT Scale, who just recently, I think it was last year, Kathy, tell me if I'm wrong, I think it was last year, they produced their new study on return on investment and found that for every dollar invested into AT, 9 were returned to the economy overall. So there you go, that's a really huge number. Kathy, is he nodding away? Or do you want to say something else? Or is no. Okay. I'm aware we've got a couple of minutes left, so I just wanted to jump into the Q&A box and see if we've got any quick questions. This is a short one. What about the skills that may be lost due to use of technology? Braille literacy is an example. I'm afraid I don't know anything about Braille literacy, but I'm wondering if anybody else does.
I had said I'd answer it, but I saw you nodding, Rick, so if you want to jump in, feel free.
No, don't do that to me, because I don't have a very good answer to this.
Okay, well, I was going to, yeah, okay, then I was just going to check. I was just going to say that skills are relative, and I think Braille is very important from what I hear. I mean, and from speaking to people who have learnt Braille, they then go on to use audio as an interface for maybe much of their work, but they'd always return to Braille, for example, to read books, novels or relaxation. So I think skills can be expanded, not necessarily without being taken away. But I do think we change, right? I mean, how many phone numbers do you remember? I mean, it's a very simple example, but I used to know many phone numbers, and now I probably know 2 or 3 off the top of my head. So I think there is a change, and there's always resistance to change. And whenever there's resistance to change, we should have honest and open conversations about the pros and cons of any movement away from a particular technology, whether that be Braille or another technology to another form of technology. But I think that, I think that we might lose skills. We will every single one of us, gain and lose skills in our lifetime. But how we systematically put those into educational practices is, of course, that sort of has more of an ethical overhanging to it. So I think we have honest conversations. We list the pros and cons, and wherever possible, we give people the choice of how they wish to learn, and systems and teachers the choice of how they wish to teach.
Did you have anything to add, Rick, or not?
Yeah, okay, I'll give it a go. Always willing to give it a go. It's interesting. So yes, why I was nodding was because I do recognize that that is a thing. You know, there will be skills that get lost. But if you look at Braille as an example, Braille was developed to compensate for a particular group of people. But as we move to a more inclusive society, that the compensatory nature is no longer required. You know, the more inclusive society is, the more we use a universal type design rather than a compensatory design. Yes, we will lose some of those skills or some of those technologies as they were. But if we're moving towards a more inclusive society, I'm not entirely sure that I think that is necessarily a bad thing.
I suppose at the end of the day, it needs to be down to the individual
Yeah, sure.
to tell the world what works for them. And that's not necessarily the same for everybody. Yeah. I would really love to continue the conversation, but we're already 1 minute over time, which I think says that we've all had a really good natter about inclusive educational technology. But before I end this conversation, I wonder if anybody had any final thoughts themselves on kind of what the future looks like and what we can do to make sure it's as inclusive as possible in education. Any final thoughts from anybody on the panel?
I think
maybe I'll just.
Sorry, go ahead, Robert.
Maybe I'll just say that it's been particularly interesting for me to hear about projects that are happening all around the world, and kind of clearly sharing the outcomes of different experiments and pilots and approaches that are being taken is going to be really helpful. And the things that I've mentioned in the UK would be good to sort of compare and contrast with other initiatives. So that's a positive I've taken away. And thank you all.
Lovely. Kathy?
I give my time to Charlotte.
Thank you, Kathy. No, I was just going to say, you know, we need to continue to share, to continue to network, continue to invest in this space, because we do need to have more research. And it's not something that will happen if there isn't a deliberate focus on investing in it. So more research, more networking, more engagement, and just ensuring that, you know, we're all moving in the same direction would be my sense.
Thank you. Rick, do you have any final thoughts?
Just really, I'd like to thank you guys for putting the event together. Like, as you could probably tell from my opening, I could talk about this topic all day, and you know, every day of the week. So it's been a great opportunity to be allowed to talk for a few minutes and engage with people who are obviously like-minded from around the world.
Asma, I wonder if you've got any final thoughts as well.
Just to say thank you. And, you know, I think we often talk about building back more inclusively. We say post-pandemic. I'm not sure we're quite post yet, but it really does present an opportunity for us to reconsider, go back to the drawing board and look at what we can do better and differently. And it's a fantastic opportunity that would be a shame to pass up. So hopefully we'll be able to capitalize on that. And again, thanks so much for this opportunity today.
No problem. Well, I'll give my 2 cents and then I'll say goodbye to everyone. And that is that when we were organising this event with our friends over at BATA, we were thinking about making this a very sort of UK focused conversation, but I'm really glad that we didn't, because I think that it's shown sort of broken the silo a little bit on this impression that high income countries have kind of got everything right and the struggle isn't there too. Rural, you know, I'm from a rural place. I can tell you right now, internet access was not a strength. So, you know, and certainly, you know, throughout my education as well, it hasn't always been easy. So I don't think high income countries have got it right. And I definitely see some similarities across the world. So I think kind of aligning ourselves to our income and more to the human experience is a good way of looking at this challenge. And I just want to say as well, thank you to everyone who's joined and all of our panelists. And I really hope this is not our only conversation. Over the next few years, GDI Hub is going to continue to talk about EdTech. So I hope you can stay with us on the conversation. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Bye.
Hi. Thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate it.
No worries. Take care. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Jenny. Lovely working with you.
Yeah. Thank you, Jay. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, do we have everything we need?
Yes, I think as Claire saved, I think that's all good. Yep, we'll find to end.
Okay, thanks. Thanks everyone. Bye.